My name is Susan, and I'm joining you today from Seoul, South Korea. I'm part of the Global Assembly team, and I think the easiest way to describe what it is that we're doing is that we're architects, right? We're building the pegs or the infrastructure to bring in the voices of everyday people, just like you and me, into how decisions are made at the global level. And I think, like most architects, one of the key questions at the center of our project is about longevity. And it's about carving out a permanent place for everyday people at the global governance table. And so this year is our launch year, and the Global Assembly is in session. And what this means is we've selected 100 everyday people from around the world, not by election or self-selection, but rather through a global lottery. And the lottery was designed so that these 100 people are a representative sample of what the global family looks like. And these 100 people who look like what the global family looks like have been deliberating to answer the question, how should humanity address the climate and ecological crisis in a fair and effective way? And this assembly will continue to deliberate and present their final outcomes next year. And I think it was just about 2 years ago, almost now, that in the beginning of 2020, I was in Madrid and I met up with a friend of one of my Korean aunties in Madrid. And I remember really clearly this guy explaining to me this new idea that he said he had come up with, right? And the idea was simple. It was you gather a representative snapshot of a populace, right? And then you have them learn from experts, but most importantly, each other and their lived experiences, and begin to co-create solutions for the problems that affect them the most. I couldn't imagine that this didn't already exist. I couldn't imagine that, at this point, we're 75 years into the creation of the United Nations. How could a citizen's counterpart at the global decision-making level not exist yet? And it was coming out of this initial response of absolute certainty that humanity must have gotten to this point and realizing that we hadn't yet, that I think was the first trigger to me sort of dropping everything else that was happening in my life and committing to this journey up until now. But I think, secondly, what came to mind quite clearly in that moment, in that coffee house, was that this infrastructure was a logical sort of next step to what was happening, what people who looked like me, young people, were doing out in the streets, in the protests, specifically and particularly around climate change. Right, here we are out in the streets, sort of there's an outpouring of solutions, and I suppose what you could call policies coming from young people that are innovative and creative. And you see much of that going down the drain. And I think the problem that I recognized in that coffee house was a question about what kind of infrastructure are those solutions being contributed by young people going into? What kind of decision-making systems are uptaking these contributions? So this is why I see the Global Assembly as sort of a call and response, logical next step to the work that is already happening from people in my generation on the streets. I spent most of my childhood growing up in Korea, but I did move to the US sort of when I was 16, and that was 2016. And I entered the United States in a period of obviously lots of political turmoil. And for my whole life being raised in Korea, I had been taught to sort of think about America as this cradle, right, of democracy, and particularly electoral democracy. And I was quite excited to enter into this country where I had all of these sort of preconceived notions of what America would look like. And when I entered into that, all I heard from my peers were wariness and sort of devastation around the failures of what their country's democracy was achieving at the moment. And I think it was at this moment that I felt the most amount of frustration and most amount of sort of stagnation and feeling of helplessness in what I could do, what my peers could do. And maybe one other reason why this sort of moment, right, in the coffee house was so transformative for me was because I think before that moment, I felt completely unable and helpless to affect change. And what that coffee house moment does for me in my understanding of the political system, of the ways in which young people can affect change, is that it blows all of the windows open, right? Because young people, it turns out, aren't dissatisfied, aren't disenchanted with democracy as a whole or democratic participation. Rather, they're disenchanted with a very particular brand, or what I think can be called iteration, of what democracy looks like. And when you detach those labels from it and say, hey, democracy can look like 100 people who were selected by lottery from pins that were dropped onto a map, then it completely changes the possibilities of what young people can do, of what everyday people can do. Often we like to say at the Global Assembly that actually the most pressing priority, the most pressing solution, is to come up with better ways of how we actually come up with the solutions themselves, right? It's about the decision-making systems that we take and we use to generate these solutions. And I think more than any other crisis, perhaps, the climate crisis is a good example of a crisis that is also symptomatic of the governance crisis. And COP particularly is a great example of sort of the surplus of great ideas, great solutions existing left and right, and yet they're sort of actioning being obstructed by the silos, and they're entering into outdated and worn and weary governance systems. And so I want to sort of ask people listening to think about this split between the policy and the process. Specifically in climate change, right, I think the policy space is so hypersaturated. We're full of innovative, creative, amazing solutions. But in many cases, the sorts of systems, the processes these solutions are entered into are remnants of an outdated age. And so I think what I would keep coming back to in thinking about what is the most pressing issue of our time is sort of continue to put on the glasses that I had on when I was first in that coffee house. And when I first listened to this idea of a permanent infrastructure at a global process involving everyday people, which is that this is common sense, that this needs to exist to be able to take in all of the solutions that people, amazing people, are offering left and right. My parents' generation in Korea, who were protesting on the streets in their student days to fight martial law, weren't just fighting for electoral democracy so that they could live out, the rest of their lives in a particular model or under a particular model. They were doing it to be able to create the conditions in the future that were nourishing enough, that would make it possible for me and my generation to then be able to continue iterating, say, we can do better than this. So I think in 50 years, in my heart of hearts, I want to be in a world where something like the Global Assembly, right, an infrastructure for everyday people at the global level that is permanent, is something that's as well recognized as the United Nations and sort of a daily part of our existence and something that is taken for granted. But I also want that to be accompanied, and perhaps as a byproduct of this, a planet that is sustainable enough, that is clean enough and safe enough to allow our next generations to be able to say, hey, we can do better than that. I mean, yes, because I trust the incredible capacity of humanity. Now, do I think that capacity is being tapped into? The answer is no. So I think the more important question is whether we plan on tapping into the incredible ability, capacity, whether it's from accrued knowledge or lived experience of every single person on Earth, or whether we want to leave that sitting to the detriment of everyone, the collective detriment. And I think the underlying faith, right, behind processes like the Global Assembly that decentralize power, that trust the collective wisdom, is about trusting plurality. And the faith that when we have more of our voices, more of the incredible diversity that exists on planet Earth, hands on deck in co-creating solutions for how we plot our way forward, the more effectively we can do that. I think I would say to them that you're also capable of change. The ones who are in power, and I think the individuals and institutions, corporations that many in my generation now feel betrayed by, have proven that they're capable of system change when they sense danger, when they sense the need for a paradigm shift. The fact that we're celebrating, right, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, sort of born in this period of transformative, never before seen global cooperation, is a testament to this, that those in power can affect system change when they feel the need to. I would want to end and finish this off by extending the invitation for everyone listening to not only join the Global Assembly as an observer, but as one of its members. Anyone, anywhere around the world, can now run their own community assembly. This means that you use the same information materials and process as the 100 members who presented their declarations recently at COP26, and follow along on their journey by running your own community event in your locality. And you can do this by going to the Global Assembly website at globalassembly.org and register to run your own community assembly today.